So the workshop name is based on the local tree care provider's webpage. This is a list of tree care companies that serve as a resource for the public who want to hire a qualified tree care professional. The page averages about 500 page visits a month, and when a city employee is asked to recommend a company, they will often refer people to the list rather than making an individual recommendation. There are a few criteria to get on the list. The first is that a certified arborist from a tree care provider must attend the workshop once a year to stay current with any tree code changes. The provider has to have an active Portland business license, have no documented tree code violations or problematic permit applications, and there are probably over 200 tree care companies working in Portland. And these requirements to get on the list serves the public in finding a qualified company. Occasionally, a company is removed from the list. This may happen for one or more reasons. They may have a documented tree code violation in the past year. They may have continued issues with permit applications. Perhaps their Portland business license is not current, or they do not have a certified arborist on staff. Also, the company may not have sent a representative to the workshop in over a year. So companies can and do return to the list after being removed. So Title 11, Trees in Portland, is the Portland's tree code. You can find it online. It has 11 chapters, and the ones listed on the right are some that are used most often by tree care providers. If you only look up a couple of chapters, we recommend 11.4 tree permit requirements and 11.8 definitions and measurements. Before we dive into the details of Title 11, I want to point you to the city's website. There's a great walkthrough of much of what I'm going to cover today on the Urban Forestry's website. And you can go to tree permits and then look for the "Do I need a permit" topic. If you already know what you need, you can apply for a tree permit. You can also call and leave a message for the tree technicians at 503-823-TREE. Please note that the tree line is not answered live unless you're reporting an emergency. Be prepared to leave a message. The current standard of service is to return your call within 3 days. You can also send an email with your questions to trees@portlandoregon.gov. And now I'll turn it over to Bryn. Thank you, Bryn.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. Can everybody hear me all right? And hopefully you're not hearing my cat in the background. She is not happy that I shut her out of the room. All right, so let's talk about some of the staff that are here to help you. When we say call or email Urban Forestry, the tree techs are the ones you're contacting. That's the team that I'm leading. We provide customer service to the entire city, so that includes local tree care providers, community members, other bureaus like PBOT and BDS, or Bureau of Developmental Services. Here are some of the things that we do. We make sure that the application you all are submitting, whether that's a replant removal or a pruning, is complete. We help schedule inspections. We issue some over-the-counter applications. And we also will review development plans for street trees. So that is going to change in July 1st. With the formation of the Portland Permitting and Development team. Other things that we do, we're here to help guide you through any special permitting circumstances. And really, we're here to respond to any and all voicemail emails that come in about a wide variety of topics that relate to forestry. All right, so let's dig into it. We are going to talk about tree permits for non-development situations. And after the break in part 2, we'll switch gears and Dan will focus on trees when development is involved. First off, what do we mean by non-development? This is tree work that is not related to or part of a larger development or project. For example, new construction, additions, and/or exterior renovations. So an example of non-development tree work, tree permits have to do with like a street tree that needs a limb pruned, or a large private tree that is dead or dying and needs to be removed. For these situations, a non-development tree permit would most likely be needed. So when would a tree permit be required? You can think of this slide as a cheat sheet for non-development permit situations. For private trees 12 inches in diameter or greater, a permit is required for removal and replanting. Overlay zones and plan districts have different rules, so it's a good idea to check in with the tree text first when you're in those areas. For street trees and heritage trees, you're almost always going to need a permit. Removal and replanting application fees are currently $100 for 1 to 3 trees. For the 4th tree, any additional trees, there's a 25 additional fee per tree. We also have our financial waiver program for customers that are part of the Water Bureau's billing discount. For more information on that, I can put that in the chat. Now let's go through some situations where you don't need a permit. So number one, it's a city-owned street tree, but the cuts are small, so a 1/2 inch or less on branches and a 1/4 inch or less on roots. Situation two, you're taking out a street tree that are volunteers. Again, we're looking at 1/2 inch or smaller, or sucker shoots 1/2 inch or smaller. Situation three would be pruning on a private property when it's not in an overlay zone or planned district, and we'll cover those in more detail soon. You're also doing pruning in line with industry standards, so no topping or lines tailing, for example. Situation four, you do not need a permit to plant trees on private property when it isn't part of a permitted tree removal. And situation five, if you're removing private trees that are below the size of the trees that are regulated, as long as the trees were not required to be preserved by a previous decision, like a land use review. Now, there are certain situations where these regulations may be different regardless of the size, species, or work type. For example, heritage trees will always require a permit. County urban pockets are areas that are outside the city limits, but within the Multnomah County area, where rules apply for trees in development, but not in non-development situations. Emergencies go through the standard permit process, but the timeframe's altered to allow for retroactive permitting. And back to overlay zones and plan districts, we recommend contacting urban forestry about it if that applies. You can look at Title 11, Chapter 1140, Table 40-1 to get familiar with how those rules apply in those areas. And then lastly, we do have programmatic permits that go through kind of a different permit process altogether. As you get more familiar with Title 11, you'll start to notice that certain factors translate into what kind of permit you'll get. So is it a native tree or is it on the nuisance species list? Is the diameter over 3, 6, 12, or 20 inches? Where is it located? Is it within 10 feet of a building or structure? Is it in an environmental overlay zone? Who owns the tree? Is it public or private? What condition is it in, healthy or high risk? So after you've determined that a tree permit is required, here's kind of a basic overview of what the permitting process is. I'll be saying this a lot, but if you have any questions as you work through this process, the tree techs are here to help answer any questions you may have. You may notice that we refer to the removal replant permit and not just a removal permit. The replanting part of the meeting the permit conditions, it is a very important outcome of the process, but hasn't always been verified in the past. So replacing trees that are removed is a vital part of keeping Portland's urban forest growing. We do have a new team that is addressing step 5 in the removal replant process. This is our canopy assurance program, and they do inspect required tree plantings to ensure permit conditions are being met. All right, now we're going to go through in more detail the different non-development permit types. We have separated it into 2 broader categories. First, we're going to talk about street trees and then private property trees. First off, we'll talk about street tree pruning. So here are the guidelines for pruning street trees. You'll recall that if you're making cuts over a 1/2 inch on branches or a 1/4 inch on roots, you'll need to get a permit. Only proper pruning types are allowed, and they must follow industry standards. Clearance for street trees and sidewalks are also required. So 7.5 feet over a sidewalk and 11 feet over a residential street, or 14 feet over an arterial street. So those are those busier roads. You can often get street tree pruning permits online for free if you're the adjacent property owner or authorized rep. And the following applies. So it is a residential zone property, which includes multifamily residential. Your cuts will be less than 6 inches in diameter at stem attachment. You're performing pruning for health or clearance. So shaping and height reduction aren't eligible for these self-issued pruning permits, even if it is to achieve clearance. And also, most importantly, if the tree is not a heritage tree. So next type of pruning is root pruning. Permits are required for pruning street tree roots that are a 1/4 inch in diameter or more. It's important that the sidewalk panels are lifted before applying for this type of permit, as there is a very quick turnaround time for inspections. So it's between 1 to 2 business days. And the inspector will need to see the roots. Roots that are approved for pruning will be marked with orange spray paint, as you can see on the example on the right, and the permit will be posted on site, usually on the sidewalk barricade. All right, as we all know, especially this year, storms, vehicle collisions, construction damage, we get all sorts of situations that can make life pretty hard for urban trees. And responding in a timely manner to tree emergencies is important for safety. To make the process work for everyone, emergency pruning can be done without first obtaining a permit, as long as you can document that a clear and present danger existed and then apply for that retroactive pruning permit within 7 days. We'll get into retroactive removal replant permitting a little later on. If you're going to be planting in the right-of-way, usually the area between a street and the sidewalk, you'll need a permit as well. You can apply for one online, or you can email the application to TreesAt. The new street trees need to be planted properly to ensure that they will have a healthy start. If you have questions, you can refer to Urban Forestry Street Tree Planting Standards document to see what techniques are required. There are also spacing rules that the tree inspector will follow, so look out for their white paint marks when sighting the tree. And planting permits, there is no associated fee. Also, Urban Forestry has a published approved street tree planting list. You can find these lists on our website and as brochures. If you'd like any hard copies, please reach out to the Tree Tech team and we can work with you to get you the brochures you need. We chose not to email you each brochure, but we did include that master spreadsheet that lists all of the street trees on it. And as buyers and planters of trees ourselves, we know that it can be difficult to find the species and size of tree that's required. So we encourage you to work with the tree inspector assigned to your permit if your client wants a certain tree that doesn't meet the requirements, or if there's a different species that's readily available. It's always best to have alternates kind of lined up. All right, we're going to move on to street tree removal permits. These are classified as type A or B. First, we're going to talk about type A permits only. A permits for street tree removals are really straightforward. Is it dead, dying, dangerous, or less than 3 inches in diameter? Those are the street tree type A permit criteria. If it meets those requirements, you can pretty much count on it being issued, but not necessarily on the same day that you've submitted that application. It will still first need to go to inspection to verify all of that information first. Permits get processed in the order that they're received, so please keep in mind that there could be a lot of permits in the queue. We appreciate your patience as we head into a busier time of year. If you're wondering about the status of a permit, you can check on portlandmaps.com or again, reach out to the tree techs and we're happy to help. Other removal considerations are under type B permits for street tree removals. They're everything else that did not fall into that type A permit criteria. These are healthy trees that are considered on a case-by-case basis. Some of the main reasons people apply for permits to remove these trees are because of their location, their species, particularly nuisance species, their growth habit, or conflicts with surrounding infrastructure. A tree inspector may take into account the impact that the removal will have on the surrounding neighborhood. For emergency street tree removal permits, the language should already look pretty familiar with you. It's similar to the emergency street tree pruning. Basically, these are for situations where there is not enough time to get a removal replant permit because of a clear and present danger. You'll need to do your best to document the issue with photos or other documentation, and then apply for a retroactive permit within 7 days of the emergency. This year, we experienced an unprecedented storm event in January, and there was an emergency declaration by the mayor. And this, in turn, aimed at trying to make the retroactive removal replant process easier for the community and all involved. At this time, I'm not sure if that new process of waiving permit fees will become the norm, but I'm hopeful that the city will look into more ways to support the community during those very stressful, trying times.
Hey, Brent, can I interrupt you 1 moment?
Yeah.
There's a participant trying to get in. Can you go to
Oh, yeah,
participants
sorry.
and admit her, please?
How do I do that?
You scroll down to your toolbar where it says participants. And then you should see at the top of the
Okay.
list, admit.
Okay. Sorry about that all.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay. I think I got everybody in. Okay. All right. So other activities or other permits that might be required. While removal and pruning are the most common types, really anytime an activity has the potential to impact a street tree, you'll need a permit. This includes things like attaching lights, signs, art, or cabling and bracing systems. Chemical applications like an insecticide, fungicide, or herbicide will also require a permit for street trees. So those were the different kinds of street tree permits. Now we're going to change topics and talk about private tree permits. In general, a permit is not required for pruning trees on private property. There can be an exception for this for trees in environmental overlay zones, so using portlandmaps.com to determine the zoning of a property is always a good idea. And we'll go over how to do this in a little bit later. Also keep in mind, pruning that affects the physiological viability of a tree is considered an unpermitted removal, so that includes things like topping, girdling, poisoning, or drowning. All right. For private tree removals, trees of certain sizes require permits. 12 inches in diameter and larger is the most common threshold for size where a permit is required. This can drop to as low as 6 inches in diameter in certain plan districts and overlay zones. There are two tables, one that I've mentioned before, it's that 40-1 table, and 40-2 that will summarize that information. Just like with street tree removal permits, there are type A and B for private trees. First, we'll go over type A permits. Again, those are what we might consider the most straightforward. So condition, location, species, the number and size of the trees can affect whether a private tree will qualify for an A permit. For condition, only trees that are dead, dying, or dangerous will qualify. Trees within 10 feet of a building or attached structure will also qualify. Private trees that are on the nuisance species list will also qualify, and you can find that on the city's website on the Portland plant list or the nuisance list. And up to 4 trees between 12 inches in diameter and less than 20 inches in diameter also qualify for this type A permit. For type B, these include healthy trees that do not meet any of the previous criteria that I went over for type A. That means they're not within 10 feet of a building or attached structure, they're not a nuisance species, and they are 20 inches in diameter or more. Or if you're requesting to remove more than 4 trees that are 12 inches in diameter or greater. For type B permits for private trees, you'll need to include the reason for removal on the application. And it's always a good idea to provide as much information as possible to help paint a clear picture for the tree inspector when they're reviewing your application. Type B permits, they will always go out for inspection. The tree inspector assigned to the permit application will be looking for certain review factors. They'll be considering whether there are practical alternatives to removing the tree. For example, could it be pruned to accomplish the objectives stated and the reason for the removal? And the inspector will consider whether the tree species is the right one for the location. They'll also take into consideration the tree's growth habit and its effects on any surrounding trees. All of the conditions needed to be met for a removal replant permit to be issued are spelled out in Title 11. Tree inspectors are bound by those regulations, and so there are conditions that tree inspectors will not be able to consider or will not consider. Some of the common reasons that people provide but aren't considered are the trees make too much shade, that it's messy, or that the owner wants to change the ground level without a permit. Also, if removal of the trees pose a safety risk, perhaps to other trees or the hillside, then removal will not be permitted. Remember, these are the healthy, non-nuisance species trees, usually over 20 inches in diameter. So the standards are higher to remove them. So we covered the different permit types that apply to trees, but there may have been some words or ideas that were not very familiar to everyone. We'll go over some of those now in more detail, starting with overlay zones. Certain areas of the city have significant natural resources or environmentally or culturally sensitive features, such as floodplains, wetlands, scenic views, steep slopes, native vegetation, or historic elements. The city acknowledges these sensitive areas by restricting certain activities to protect resources that provide benefits to the public. There are a few different ways to find out the zoning that applies to a property you'll be working at. One is to go to the Bureau of Development Services Zoning Basics webpage. This research probably offers the most background and information about the zoning. Another useful resource is the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability zoning app. This is an interactive app that lets you find the zoning for a particular property And you can click on the links that go back to the information about that zone on another page. And you can also, again, reach out to the tree techs. So 823 Tree or trees@portlandoregon.gov if you are having trouble figuring out if you're working in one of those special zones. Another term that people are not always familiar with is mitigation. You may have noticed that the tree removal permit is called the removal and replanting permit. Again, replanting or mitigating trees that are removed is a crucial part of a healthy urban forest. Currently, Portland has a tree cover of 29.8%. This is under the citywide goal of 33.3%. We know that we depend on trees for a good quality of life, but often our collective actions are not always supporting that tree canopy. So ensuring that replanting is happening along with that removal is helping helping slow down that decline. It's relatively rare, but there are instances where you can apply for a waiver to not replant trees. Please keep in mind, if you apply for a replanting waiver, the permit, that removal replant permit will automatically go to inspection, even if it would have otherwise met the criteria to be approved without inspection. So those over-the-counter permits. There is a $100 density inspection fee. Times when a waiver might be successful are if density standards have already been met, the tree was not required to be there by any other rules, or that the density standard poses an unreasonable burden on the applicant. The waiver needs to be submitted with the removal replant application, and it's not something that you'll want to turn in afterwards, as it can cause lots of delays. And even if a waiver was granted in the past and more trees are submitted for removal at a later date, the old waiver won't apply. So a little bit more on how density works. A tree inspector will evaluate existing trees and determine if trees are small, medium, or large canopy species. Then they will credit the site based on these sizes. So large tree types count for 1,000 square feet, medium types count for 500 square feet, and small tree types count for 300 square feet. Keep in mind that dead, dying, dangerous, or nuisance trees will not be credited. So removal replant permits, they expire after a year, so 365 days. The mitigation that was a condition of the permit needs to happen before that permit expires. Unless there was an approved replanting waiver, the replanted tree will need to be confirmed either by a staff inspection or self-certification through a link on the Urban Forestry website. Since the planting season is generally October through May, attention will be needed to the time frame of that permit. And occasionally a permit decision may be appealed either by the property owner, the applicant, or even the public if public notice was required. Appeals should be filed within 14 days of the permit decision. There's a $200 appeal fee, and the Urban Forestry Commission Appeals Committee will make a final decision. Before we get into how to fill out a removal replant application, I wanted to briefly touch on the heritage tree permit application process. If any work is needed to be done on a heritage tree, you'll need a permit. The heritage tree application can be found on Urban Forestry's website and can be submitted by email or paper mail. There are no associated fees. If you are not sure if your tree is a heritage tree, you can now check online at portlandmaps.com. But if you're still not sure, reach out to the tree techs and we can assist in verifying. Just to note that heritage trees can't be removed unless they are dead, dying, or dangerous. So that type A permit. When needed, heritage tree removals will start with the submission of a heritage tree permit application, and only the Urban Forestry Commission can approve heritage tree removals for non-emergency removal requests. For heritage trees that are dangerous or have fallen over, so qualify as emergencies, please contact urban forestry for emergency removal. Urban forestry can approve emergency removals and provide retroactive permits for tree failures. And more information on private heritage trees is located on the Portland website. All right, we are getting there. Thanks for sticking it out, everybody. I know it's a lot of information. So after determining that you need a permit and what type, the next step is filling out the application. When you're filling out a permit application, please make sure you're using the current version. So you can find that on Urban Forestry's website. Complete the entire application and you can mail it in or submit it online. You can make an in-person appointment to meet with a tree tech if you need any assistance filling it out. And we have a handout that goes over DevHub, which is our online permitting system, where you'll submit those applications online. So a real slowdown to the permit application process is when the application isn't complete. It's usually missing one of these things, so a signature, the tree species that will be replanted, the site plan, or any photos. If you have any questions, please reach out. We're always happy to help. And if you do know the cause of death or any other significant information, please put it in that permit application. I know the line on there maybe isn't long enough in time, so feel free to load any attachments with any narrative or detail that's needed to paint that full picture about the request. So photos are really important. Remember to show the diameter at breast height or DBH of the trunk with a measuring tape around it. A close-up of the measurement is great, so we can read that measurement, but we also need a photo of the whole trunk. Same with measuring distance. By all means, have a close-up of that measurement, but also include the entire distance so we can clearly see the trunk of the tree as well as the building or structure. Other photos that help identify the tree and its overall form should also be included. Again, remember you're documenting and painting a picture for the inspector to review. So measuring the diameter of a tree is an important part of the application process. Remember chapter 11.8, definitions and measurements from the beginning of the presentation. If you haven't read that before, be sure to thumb through it. There's also a video on the website that gets many views a year on how to do measurements. So don't be embarrassed at all if you need a refresher. So while diameter tapes are the industry standard for measuring DBH, if you don't have one, you can use a regular measuring tape. Just divide that number in inches by 3.14 or pi. So a tree with a circumference of 76 inches, for example, would have a diameter of 24.2 inches. For those of you who are tech savvy, please note we can't accept measurement photos where it's your phone that has taken the measurement. We're definitely a little old school, so please use a tape measure or a diameter tape to show and confirm that diameter. Here are some not so straightforward examples of how to take the diameter of a tree. So if a trunk is leaning, you're going to, instead of measuring 4.5 feet up, you're going to measure 4.5 feet from the base of the trunk in the direction of the lean, and then measure your diameter from there. If it's on a hillside, you're measuring from the middle of the trunk at ground level, not on the high or low side of the tree. If the trunk is split less than 4.5 feet from the ground, you can measure the smallest circumference or diameter below that lowest branch. For multi-stem trees, you're going to measure the largest stem and then add half of the total of number of inches for the rest of the stems. A multi-stem tree has trunks that are connected above the ground and doesn't include individual trees growing close together or from a common rootstock that does not have trunks connected above the ground. All of these examples can be found on Urban Forestry's website for your future reference. Oops, sorry, went backwards. Okay, so as I measured before, replanting is a critical part of the removal replant permit requirements. These will be the trees that make up the future urban canopy, so it's important that we consider what the best tree would be for our location. We understand that it's not always easy to find a particular species that is also good stock, and we want to recognize the time and effort that goes into choosing. Having in mind what good quality stock looks like, buying from nurseries that stand behind their stock, and having a backup tree species ready to go will all help make the process go smoother. If you need to update the replant species, please contact either your tree inspector or Trees At, and we can help update your permit application or permit. Lastly, the main piece of a completed application is that site plan. I know folks can get worried about their site plans. They don't need to be stressful. So really just focus on making them easy to read and make sure you're having all that relevant information shown. So marking the trees proposed for removal and where you'll be replanting. Please, when possible, have north pointing up on your maps. This makes it easier for inspectors to figure out what tree you're talking about and helps them be as efficient as possible during their inspection. So once a permit has been issued, there are conditions that need to be met, like having the permit on site and posted for the public. Permits include a posting page. This is what you post at a job site. I've seen them posted on trees, on trucks, on posts. It just needs to be on the job site and accessible to the public. Another condition of the permit is to do the work within the time frame given. Once that time runs out, your permit has expired and is no longer valid. Again, our permits are good for a full year. If you think you'll need more time because of circumstances that have come up, contact your tree inspector who issued the permit well before that expiration time, or you can reach out to Trees At and we can help. Another condition is to replant the trees specified on the permit within that given time frame. You can check the status of a permit application online at portlandmaps.com. Again, if you have questions about where you are at in the process, please don't hesitate to reach out to the tree techs. Again, trees at portlandoregon.gov, 823-TREE. You'll have that memorized by the end of this. Just a safety reminder, call before you dig. It's the law. You can call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Make sure that calling in locates is part of your standard operating procedure every time you're going to dig. We want to make sure everybody is safe. All right, we are almost finished with part one. Thanks everybody for sticking it out. I know this is a lot of information. I'm going to switch gears and talk about impacts to our urban forest from pests and pathogens. Many of you may already be familiar with this first one and the fact that Portland has some really large iconic elm trees. Unfortunately, we lose about 40 trees per year to Dutch elm disease. Please be sure to schedule elm prunings with your clients during the winter months. Read up on inoculations and treatments, and always practice good sanitation where elms are concerned. You can learn more about DED on our website under the Elm Protections Program. And the website link is on the screen. So between April 15th to October 15th, there is a pruning moratorium on all elms in Portland. So we are currently in that moratorium. This is to help slow the spread of Dutch elm disease, which is devastating to elms. Beetles, they are beetles that spread the disease. They are most active from April to October, and they're attracted to fresh pruning cuts. So if you are hired to remove an elm, get any required permits, chip all the brush, dispose of all the wood within 24 hours, and make sure Urban Forestry gets a copy of that disposal receipt. And you can email those to us. Oops. Okay, all right, thought I skipped over one. Okay, so some of you might be aware and familiar already with the next pest. So we have emerald ash borer, or EAB. In 2022, the first sighting was in Forest Grove, Oregon. The first sighting, I should say, in the state of Oregon. And then just last year, it was found in Cornelius. These insects are devastating and have already decimated ash tree populations in the eastern US. Our native ash tree is at a high risk and will need all your help to prevent the spread. So the first step is to learn what they look like and what the signs and symptoms are. So obviously the color is in the name, so emerald. Emerald ash borers are small, green and shiny insects whose larvae eat the cambium of the tree. So they are about a ½ inch in size, and this is a great close-up view of what an adult looks like. So signs and symptoms are dead canopy, epicormic shoots. You often see D-shaped exit holes on the trunk, so that's that middle photo. And you might also see woodpecker holes or bark damage, and the S-shaped larva galleries. So that's the example on the right. So some ways to get trained up. The Oregon Department of Forestry has a great online course and it's free. The state also has information on best treatment practices and a hotline where you can report any possible infestations. So that's the 1-866 invader. Key ways that have been identified on how to slow the spread are to remove infestive trees and chip any wood to an inch in size. There are chemical treatments that have been approved for use in the city of Portland as well. For more information on the city plan for EAB, please visit our website. Currently, the plan is in an internal review, and Urban Forestry will be hiring a pest and pathogen staff. Applications, I believe it's still open, so if anyone's interested. But still look to the city website for any updates. But again, currently the city plan hasn't been published. All right, well, thank you all for making it through that fire hose of information. We have a bit of time left for any questions. Tiana, if there are any questions with people with raised hands, go ahead and unmute. And yeah, we can answer anything if folks have any questions. Cool. Well, if anybody does think of anything, I will be sticking around for the rest of the presentation. And feel free to put any questions you have in the chat. Or if you think of anything after this, just email us at trees@portlandoregon.gov. And Sam, I guess I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Bryn. Can you please make Dan Gleason the host, and then he will be able to share his slides. All right, well, thank you so much, Bryn. You did an excellent job. Loads of information, but the tree techs are available to answer questions whenever you have a question that comes up. So you can call, you can email, and they will respond. All right, Hey Dan, are you available in 10 minutes?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. Are you able to share your screen real quick just so we can make sure you're ready to go when it's time?
Yep, I'll get it going during the break.
All right, we will take a 10-minute break and you can go get a drink of water, take a stretch, pet your cat, and then come back at about 2:05 and we should have we'll start with Dan on part 2. Take it away, Dan.
Hey, everybody, welcome back from your break. Again, I'm Dan Gleason, Senior Tree Inspector with City of Portland Urban Forestry, also board certified master arborist, municipal arborist, tree risk qualified. I'm here to answer your questions about the development section. Before I get going, shoot into the chat if this is the first time you've attended a local tree care provider workshop. I see some familiar names and some that I don't recognize. And so with this, we have a pretty small group today. So I'm going to go through and talk about the Title 11 requirements that are associated with development, but I'm also going to take it a step further and give some recommendations from my experience and just have some conversations about what it means to be an arborist providing good care around development in Portland. With that, I invite you, if questions pop up, to go ahead and throw them into the chat. I'm happy to open up some discussions. That said, if you have any permit-specific questions that might be focused around a single project that you're working on, probably better avenue to discuss that one-on-one. And I'm happy to answer that question offline after the meeting. So be focused on looking at trees in development, understanding how they're permitted using site plans, talk about aspects in which arborists really are heavily involved with the process, including looking at preservation requirements, protection of both street and on-site trees, and then talk about how us as urban forestry inspectors get involved and often connect with you through the inspections process. We'll continue to talk about tree density, and I really want to look at this through another lens about how arborists can get involved creating long-term benefits here in Portland through its urban canopy, as well as discussing what happens when things go wrong, looking at some of the code violations and the correction process and times that civil penalties are needed when the code is not followed. Then we'll leave some time to discuss any changes that might be happening in the tree code and answer questions or just have general discussion at the end. So in this case, we're talking about trees in development. Bryn mentioned it a number of times, and it's very common for us in urban forestry to really have a hard divide where we talk about aspects of the tree code in development and aspects in non-development. And why this is really important is because there are different chapters within Title 11 that set sometimes vastly requirements, permitting process, mitigation, and rules. So understanding if you're engaging in which chapter of the code you're engaging with really will help you understand what permits that you need to have and what the rules are as you engage with your projects you're working on. So I'll be talking specifically about chapter 11.50. And with this, chapter 11 4.0, which is the non-development side, really lays out very specific parameters that are designed for arborists and homeowners to follow independently to get the permits they need to engage with the urban canopy. We're in development. The chapter is really geared to be more of a collaborative process in that development is typically not done by a single person, and typically arborists aren't solely involved in it, but it's a collaborative effort with contractors, designers, as well as arborists all engaging with different bureaus within the city to have a final product or outcome or new development. That said, many of the permits that you're engaged with us in urban forestry are also connected in through the Bureau of Development Services, soon to be the Portland Permitting Services. So the tree code in development holds similar goals as the non-development side. It's looking to ensure that there isn't a significant impact to the urban canopy by looking at street tree impacts, looking at on-site preservation, planting, as well as really noting that there's going to be a change in the landscape due to the development, and how can that best be done while preserving the existing trees that are around it. There are many different types of developments that go place and permits that connect to it. It can be a small egress window in a single family home to a major project within a park or city property. There are many different processes in which you can get involved, in which permits are issued through it, but they all hold similar rules and regulations laid out in the development chapter. So I want to shoot this over to you, anyone, real quick. Why do you think that there are different rules and regulations set for development versus non-development? Why did we decide to have a whole specific chapter? Just give a minute for someone to throw something into the chat, or feel free to unmute and give a shout out, and then we'll continue on.
Or it might be different reasons to remove trees or impact trees in development compared to non-development.
Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, that's a one of the great points is that when we're talking about development, we're often looking at competing uses of land and resources. And with that, it's not just looking specifically at the tree alone or trees alone of, are they a good tree? Are they dead, dying, dangerous? Are they having an impact on the existing snapshot of what the landscape is? It's about looking into the future about how land is changing and how do trees fit into that picture. With that, the criteria of what we're looking at, and also looking at urban planning in a bigger picture, really requires us to evaluate the urban canopy under a different lens. So with that is why it is extremely important that arborists are actively involved in the development process. Within development, we have experts in many different arenas, from planners to architects to contractors who can build a house from the ground up. But the expertise of how to do that and how to best do that around trees really falls into the arborists who are involved with these projects, who can engage with a high level of understanding of tree physiology, with a great understanding of overall project goals, and helping to merge these two into a successful product, and so that we can have increased and preserved canopy in Portland, as we have a constant need for more housing and a growing city. Arborists can engage in many different phases of this, of the process, from the initial concept of we want to build something to the very end of we built something and I think we may have screwed up. Some of the common phases within the city processes, which arborists are often pulled into, is in the early assistance land use phase. Again, this is before a project has even started, and this is a key one to ensure that the expertise in the trees is incorporated into the design of the projects. Oftentimes, arborists are brought in through building permits, even through helping with the design, or for implementing the actual tree work that is needed in order to accomplish the building permit goals, as well as many work that happens in the right-of-way for new roads and new sidewalk creations, which are through public works permit, as well as looking for expertise on large tree planting projects, in large city projects, on major capital in general maintenance projects on city property and city maintained sites. It can be difficult, especially if you're not actively engaged with the process, to know if tree work happening is through the development or non-development chapter of the code. A great resource is using Portland Maps to look up the property address, and we'll give you a listing of what active permits are being used at that time on that lot. And if you see active building permits or zoning permits or demolition permits, you can know that all the included tree work will be through the development chapter. Also, if you have any questions about it, maybe you see a lot just on your street and you're curious about is the tree work on there regulated or what's going to happen, you can also contact planning and zoning with questions or us at Urban Forestry. Something that's very different for trees and development compared to non-development is the way in which we permit tree work to be done. For those who've engaged in the non-development side, you apply and receive a written permit that's specific to the tree work that's taking place. In development permits, the work that's happening is often shown on the included plan sets themselves and uses what's shown on the official plans to note what is allowed to happen around the trees. We got a question from Brandon. Go ahead, Brandon.
So on the plan set you're showing here, you show the root protection zone.
Yeah.
And I was trying to look through the code the other day and I didn't see a requirement to show that. So I was curious if a developer, whoever's doing this work, has to show the root protection zone around the tree.
Nope, they don't need to show the root protection zone. Is typically shown in order to demonstrate that the plan has a scale. The plans do need to be scale so that they're demonstrating that the needed type of protection that's being implemented is accurate on the plans. And we can go into that in a little more detail when we get to the tree protection size of it.
All right, thanks, Dan.
No problem. And just noting for, as I mentioned, the collaborative process in which the trees and development are handled, it is not solely urban forestry, but we work alongside other city bureaus, including planning and zoning, to assess different aspects of Title 11 and how they're implemented on plans. So if you are going to engage with trees in development, which is a great career trajectory for many different arborists, as I said, it's something that's much needed and also engages in a creative and beneficial way to apply your expertise. You'll really want to get familiar with site plans. Site plans are the bread and butter of how tree requirements are communicated in development. In the city of Portland, site plans have a number of requirements that must happen for the most part, which is showing the existing conditions, what's on the site, and then with that, how's the site being changed? Where are new structures going to go? Where are there impervious versus pervious areas? Where is grading going to take place? And where are material storage and utilities going to take place? All these are extremely important for us as arborists to know and for me as a regulator to know, because this is painting the picture of how existing trees might be impacted. With that, once all that is shown, then it's important to know, and that's where it's used, to note what's going to happen with the trees. So here's an example site plan that you can find on the city webpage, which is a pretty standard for a typical building permit that you might see. So in this case, it's noting trees that are to be retained, as well as showing the location of the tree protection fencing that will be there. It's noting trees that'll be removed. And again, there's not a separate permit that says these trees removed. Showing these trees with an X through them is the permit that allows these trees to be removed via code, as well as showing the location, including species and planting size of new trees to be planted. So if you were given this plan and said, here, please implement this, this would help you the outline of installing tree protection fence, tree removal, and tree planting in very specific locations, all here. Something that I do want to bring up, which is hugely important, is that if you just get handed a sheet of plans that look really nice and crisp and there's X's all over it, make sure it's official. If you have older plans that did not come in digitally, you'll see a old-fashioned ink stamp on it that says certified by City of Portland. Oftentimes, most permits, I'd say after 2020, will now have a this plan meets city code or city compliance stamp on it. Before moving forward with any tree work based off site plans, ensure that you're looking for or asking about that it's official. Oftentimes, there's more information needed than what's just shown through the images on the plans. This is when we start to get into more specific arboriculture elements of the projects, and that a narrative requirement will often go along with the site plan. Sometimes this is, if it's a little bit of information, this can be included on a single page, but oftentimes it's a supporting document that goes with it. There are different tree preservation requirements that we'll get into in a minute, but with those, there are also exemptions in which an arborist is needed. One of these is looking at the tree condition. Trees that are dead, dying, or dangerous are exempt from preservation as well as mitigation, but these require supporting documentation from an arborist to show that the trees are in these conditions. There are also trees that are on the nuisance species list that are exempt from many development standards, and this requires an arborist or a landscape professional to successfully ID the tree. As you engage and work with clients, I have often seen that developers will kind of overlook this step and not think this is crucial. And then when they get into their inspection phase, because trees have been mis-ID'd, sizes recorded incorrectly, it can have huge implications on the project later and set a lot of delays and cost them a lot of money. I always recommend that they get an arborist involved early, and I would self-advocate if I was you all that how important your expertise comes in through the process. Arborists are also needed to set alternative protection measures, which we'll go into in a few slides. So we were discussing earlier, what are some of the reasons of why we must preserve trees in development? I have to have this conversation often with many different developers, in that there are trade-offs especially for developers about preserving trees in development. For many cases, it is easier to start with a blank slate, remove all trees, and plant new because they can follow very set parameters or cookie cutter guidelines of what they need. But as we know, as being arborist, a 1-to-1, a tree removed to a new tree planted is not an equal ratio of return. Significant trees that we have in our landscape will take many, many, many years for new trees to come in to create new ecosystem services. And also the location and space that trees hold will often be filled in and removed entirely if those trees are not holding place for that. It is also our job as arborists to take the information that we have been taught about the benefits of trees and really advocate for them through the development process. Oftentimes, the easiest path forward is not what's best for the trees, but it is what is going to be best for the overall project and the city as a whole. So again, I ask you all to ensure that you're really advocating and using some of the benefits that I've noted here in those conversations to discuss what final products should be in development and how important trees are within the development process specifically. It's with those intentions that the Title 11 tree code was written, to have preservation and protection requirements. Oftentimes, as arborists, there can be frustration that perhaps the code is not strict enough about the level of protection or preservation that's allowed. And that's a opinion that I hear, and I'm not going to speak to my own opinion on it, but I do always like to point out that tree preservation and tree regulation is much newer in adoption with city code as many of the other types of infrastructure that we see in the city. With that, when Title 11 was implemented, it had huge leaps in what the preservation requirements were. Previously, it was very little, and in most cases, when something moved into development, most trees could be removed with very little oversight. So I bring this up before I go into the requirements, in that this is a step in the right direction, in that the more we can document and understand the positive impacts, or where there are possibly gaps in the requirements, the more we can help shape both our city code and codes around the country. So the on-site preservation that you'll most commonly see in the city of Portland is for when there are ground disturbance associated with the development. There can be tree preservation requirements that kick in. This is for lots that are 5,000 square feet or greater, so exempt if you're under. Again, there's ground disturbance taking place, and there's less than 85% building coverage. With that, once those criteria are met, 1/3 of the trees 12 inches and larger are noted as trees that are required to be preserved. Also, as a change of last 3 or 4 years ago, now all non-exempt trees that are 20 inches or larger are required to be preserved regardless of the 1/3 status. With that, developers do have the option to pay a fee in lieu to remove additional trees over the preservation requirements. And that money goes into a tree planting fund within the city of Portland, with the idea that that will then be used to plant trees elsewhere. As noted, there are exemptions to the on-site preservation requirement. These include dead, dying, dangerous, and nuisance species trees. And there are also some areas that are zoned to be exempt from tree preservation, such as industrial and some commercial zones. I mentioned before that there is a fee that can be chosen to be used when the 1/3 preservation criteria or trees over 20 inches are chosen to be removed, and this outlines some of the cost. We always try to provide this information up front, and it's really important to get into the hands of developers. That said, as we know, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. So the fee that can be charged will not necessarily equal the ecosystem services and benefits of the trees that are lost. So as arborists, always start with the preservation of what is practical and feasible for preservation, and then the fees can be used when there are not practical means to preserve trees associated with the development. As well as on-site trees, there are street tree preservation requirements. This means that all trees that are established, so basically 3 inches, must be shown on the plans, and that trees that are 6 inches and greater, we can require up to the equivalent of 2-to-1 trees mitigation. There is not a simple pay-to-play aspect with the street trees as far as removal. They do fall under the authority of the city forester, and that is delegated to us as tree inspectors, who really view many different factors in evaluating what street trees can be removed or not for development. Oftentimes this involves evaluating the condition of the tree, and also understanding what the needs and scopes of the project that are needed to meet other city code, and how trees will come into play with that. Another huge aspect that we're really stepping up lately stepping up because of understanding the importance, is looking at tree protection. This is both in the right of way and on site. And as we know, as arborists, just choosing to preserve a tree and stopping at that can ultimately lead to that tree being removed, as there are significant impacts that can happen through development. So having a strong protection plan is also needed to have long-term outcomes. I love this picture in that there's no ground disturbance that was actually happening anywhere around this tree. And I remember when it first came in, the developers were very insistent that tree protection was not needed because they weren't doing any ground disturbance within the right of way. And it's just a clear example of oftentimes what's just simply shown on the plans versus the chaos that ensues during development is not always captured. And so thinking ahead of what may happen is crucial in setting up success for some of these trees. So I want to jump on to the on-site tree protection, and this is what Brandon was asking earlier, exactly how it needs to be shown in plans. So there are two primary means for how tree protection is shown on site plans. The first is the idea of the prescriptive path. Prescriptive meaning that there is a formula that can be followed, and in following this formula, industry standards say that trees should be preserved. So you can follow this, and it's not really dependent on some of the other aspects going on in the site. And so because of this, you don't need to have arborist oversight when noting the tree protection here, although I have found and advocate that it still can be extremely helpful because there are different ways that prescriptive path can be designed to best be beneficial within a project. So the standard prescriptive path is to recognize that there is a root protection zone around the tree that's equal to 1 foot for every inch of the tree's diameter. So 12-inch tree should have 12-foot circle around. 12 foot from the edge of the tree to the edge of the circle. Protect that. Tree should be preserved from development. Without, due to the nature of development really not existing to allow for just singular circles, there's a lot more straight lines. There is an allowed encroachment at 25%, no more than half the tree's radius. This is follows a lot of trees development best industry standards that were set over, and for the most part, what I've seen is pretty successful when done right into setting up success for the trees. For street trees, it really comes down to what us as tree inspectors and the city forester can work to note what is needed to preserve those trees. So here's just a visual demonstration of how the tree protection could be outlined and where the encroachments would lay. And again, this should be clearly shown on the plans, noting where the fencing is, as well as noting that it's 6-foot chain link fence. The other option is what's called performance path. And this is when the prescriptive path can't be followed or is not practical. We, as the city, allow for a site-specific tree protection plan to be initiated, which relies on an arborist to prepare a plan, which clearly demonstrates that the tree will not be negatively impacted and its preservation status will maintain through the project. This is one of the primary ways that arborists get involved with the development aspect of the plans. So with that, I'm going to talk through some different elements of it, and also give some advice from my experience with it. That said, I know there are a number of you who actively create these type of plans, and I welcome you to jump in if you have any feedback or questions that you want to bring up. As I said, I'm happy to make this a discussion. So on the city's website, we have a guideline for arborist report. It's, especially if you're new to creating arborist reports, it's a really great outline of all the aspects of the narrative that we need to see in an arborist report to accept it for performance path. One of the key things that I recommend that you constantly ask about is that the protection is based on the most recent set of plans. In development, site plans get updated and changed a ton, especially in the design process. So you really want to have that conversation and communication that you're creating a plan based on actually what's going to be built and not some initial plans, because it will not make sense when you get to actual construction. Another aspect is that a tree protection plan that you're creating can be seamlessly incorporated into the construction plans, meaning that if you are independently creating a tree plan that just shows giant tree protection zones all over the place, and the construction plan shows that they're going to be trenching in utilities where you're showing that fencing, obviously those don't match, and your protection plan is not very helpful. Also use best management practices. Our industry has been really stepping up and trying to look at different ways that we can understand how trees are impacted through development, and set practices and protocols that arborists can follow to ensure that what they're choosing follows industry standards. I always look at that as to ensure that what you're putting forward is defendable. If you have a protection plan and you submit it, and I look at it and say, why are you doing this? Explain to me what's happening here. You can walk me through the rationale of each decision you're doing, which is based off those best management practices. Lastly, always provide pathways to success based on the site conditions there. I see a lot that when there is areas where work is going to be allowed close to trees, the means that a protection plan is put forward is arborist oversight, roots over 2 inches won't be impacted. Where I have seen that go awry many times is, while you're doing that oversight, what happens when there are roots over 2 inches there? You need to make sure that you're having conversations with the developers and setting different pathways for ideally what you think is going to happen. Then if you're overseeing impacts and you have new information that comes up, then everyone's on the same page about what different outcomes can be based on what you're seeing, and that's clearly communicated through your arborist report. Unfortunately, we are not magic, and so just watching someone trench near a tree does not actually protect that tree. So the best way that you can get involved with tree protection or tree protection plans is before development has gone, and ideally in the design phase. And again, this is where you're really going to outline why can't prescriptive paths just be used? Why does development need to take place closer to trees? And then outlining a clear plan for how they will go about their work while protecting those trees. That said, oftentimes when either a performance path has not been correctly followed, or developers chose a prescriptive path and then did not follow that plan, there are already development activities that occurred on site, and arborists are asked to assess the damage and create a new plan. So with that, again, I ask you to lean on some of the best practices of looking at some mitigation and treatments that can be used. And also just note that the assessments that you make will be attached to your name and your discretion of when you're looking at have impacts allowed a tree to remain viable and still be eligible for preservation, or if the impacts that have taken place truly exempted the tree from its preservation status due to a change in condition. The key that I found for very successful arborist reports, more information the better based on the actual trees that you're looking at. The formulas that we have are great, but as we know, especially in urban environments, trees are facing many different unique circumstances, especially what's going on within the roots in the soil. Through years where I thought I would find roots, there were no roots. For places where I am baffled of how roots got there, there have been a ton of roots from trees. And so in order to make a protection plan that really sets for success for the project, taking the time and doing the due diligence of doing some preliminary root excavation, looking at the tree, doing a careful history of the site, and really digging into using your knowledge of how trees grow to set up stage for your best protection plan is really going to set the project up for success. You'll also see, if you're looking at plans, that we have street protection specifications. You might see in a plan that we have urban forestry has put a stamp that just says this tree can use basic tree protection. And what that language says is that you don't need to actually have anything around the tree, but there is an exclusion of things that can happen within the permeable area around the tree, including ground disturbance, construction, storage, putting a portage on, all those things. So basically, if you see that and you're guiding, don't need to put anything up, just make sure that there are no impacts going on there. We also have a prescriptive path here, which is following this P582 document, which outlines some different ways that that are standard ways that a tree can be protected. And then again, a performance path is a arborist specific plan for preserving the tree. So oftentimes where your tree preservation plans meet us urban forestry regulation is during the tree preservation inspection phase. For us as tree inspectors, these can be very great, easy inspection as long as everything's followed. What was shown on the plan was implemented successfully on the site. The trees are looking good and protected. These are supposed to occur before any ground disturbance activities occur, but oftentimes they don't. And we do due diligence of checking the protection criteria as well as looking what you prescribed in your arborist report and making sure those are followed. Oftentimes, if these have not, it can create a violation or a situation where these inspections are not passed. And when there's a performance path, you'll often be called back in to evaluate the impacts that have happened, and do further exploration and documentation to either ensure us as the city that the trees are still viable for preservation or deem that they're not. And we work with the developers to move forward from that point on. If there's a violation or additional fees that need to be collected. Yeah, the question is, are hand rendered plans accessible for protection plans? Yes, they can. There's not a set specific detail that is needed, but they do need to be scaled if there are specific dimensions and distances that are in part of the plan. So another aspect that arborists are often pulled in onto is during street tree removals. Street tree removals in development are very different than in non-development in that we are looking at the needs of the right-of-way for the development projects, as well as the specific conditions of the tree, and also looking at projects of an overall canopy creation lens. For example, we may be more accepting to letting a 12-inch pair be removed in order to redevelop the right-of-way that would allow for a number of 4 new trees from our approved species to go in. Oftentimes, developers believe that trees need to be removed due to meet other code requirements. For example, they need to put in new utilities, or they believe that aspects of the development are going to require those trees to be removed. When those happen, if it is not a clear-cut picture, or something that us as tree inspectors can easily assess and understand, we ask them for technical documentation, technical analysis of really showing and doing a alternative design and doing great due diligence to show that the tree needs to be removed. It can happen, and oftentimes an arborist gets involved. Trees that were developers thought needed to be removed really can be protected through a high performance protection plan. As an arborist working in development of street trees, I think this is probably your #1 goal, and it takes a very strong understanding of communication with the developers or what it's going to take to build the building, and then weighing those impacts and the actual impacts of that's going to happen to the trees. I'm going to jump now over to, we talked about tree preservation, now tree planting. The development code also triggers new planting associated with development. There are thresholds in which a project has to have for on-site density to kick in. So currently it's if a project's over 163,650, then the site needs to be brought up to on-site density. That said, and there are exemptions for that, so they're on the right there. There's also street tree density, which has a much lower threshold. It's projects that have a assessed value of 25,000 or greater are required to bring the right of way, as long as there's at least a 3-foot area to plant trees located there, to have one new tree planted every 25 linear feet. So the on-site density is designed to favor more trees in areas that are zoned to have more open space or less competition of land and use. So you see that 1 and 2 family residential, the expectation is that there's more area to plant trees than something like an industrial area where under code is understood that that land's going to have much higher competition. That said, you can see there are times that planting is required. Similar to the non-development density standards, these are based on the potential mature canopy thresholds for what they count for as far as square footage density. So you can see large canopy would count for 1,000, medium for 500, small 300. And so as these gets triggered, the new trees that are planted will each count for these, and they can be added up to get to the required percentages. So there are options within this. Again, I am highly advocating developers to get arborists involved with these planting plans and not just the preservation plans, because we all know that the species that you pick, the locations you pick, can have significant benefits to the urban canopy, in that not all planting plans will have the same final benefit. We know that the return on getting large form trees planted is much greater than some of the small form trees that are out there. In that competition within the urban area is very specific to where trees can do well, looking and understanding soil conditions, light availability, water, maintenance, care. These are all things that should go into the conversation about how to set up a successful planting on a site, in that we as arborists are going to be some of the best suited to help engage in these conversations. I love this. This shows this tree was counted for density for this project. And to me, it really just outlines the need for looking with tree knowledge and getting the right tree in the right place, so that we're setting up success and for a growing urban canopy that is growing the right way. So both on the non-development and the development side, there are times where the code is not followed and leads to a violation, which has different processes for it. This can involve removals without a permit, pruning that doesn't follow industry standards, or not adhering to some of the requirements in areas such as environmental zones. Most of the violations that we get are observed through the public, which are reported to urban forestry, which we investigate, looking to understand what has happened and where the breach of code has taken place. Some of the topping and excessive pruning ones are ones that we often see associated with less reputable or less knowledgeable arborists or homeowners, as well as the failure to install and maintain tree protection during development is one that comes up often, which we need to pull in arborists back into the development scene. The goal of urban forestry is the best option is to help restore impacts to the specific trees that may have been impacted through the violation. But oftentimes, if trees have been removed, there are additional fees and additional planting that's assessed and applied to the specific area. There are often also times where civil penalties are applied, where the fees that are set under our fee chart will not cover the impacts and loss of what the violation held. Violations can stick with a tax lot and a property for a while, and can be have different impacts based on the type of violation and who is held responsible for it. For example, if you as a contractor are found to be the one who performed the violation, you had a permit to prune a tree and you did a hack job, that's where you might get removed from the local tree care provider. A property owner who removed a tree without a permit themselves might face enforcement penalties that can even go as far as a nuisance abatement, a lien on their property, and would be handled under our code of compliance group. This is our current fee schedule with the violations that are the costs of the ones that are out there. You can see, especially the ones that are associated per inch, can jump up pretty quick and pretty costly. But again, especially for this group here, our goal is to help prevent any of these from taking place through good communication and good work with the homeowners that we're working with. So in wrapping up, just want to touch base again that for the timeline of city codes and type of city codes, Title 11 is still pretty new. We're going on our 10-year anniversary coming up pretty soon. And with that, we're still pulling in a lot of information oversight. We're still collecting data. And as we know, tree data is slow to understand the impacts and consequences that some of our decisions have. And with that, we really rely on ground truthing and information for those who are engaging with the tree code every day, which is you, our arborist community. So there are many great groups out there that are asking for arborists to get together to share their thoughts and opinions and expertise about what's happening here in Portland. I highly recommend getting involved and using your expertise to communicate that, and also reach back out to us at Urban Forestry. There are ways that you can provide input, either from just contacting us at trees@portlandoregon.gov, or we'll often have a number of different portals and surveys that will come through our Tree Bark newsletter that are a great way to give input. Anytime there's code amendments that are coming up in the future, there's a public comment period for that as well, which is a great time to communicate some of the unintended consequences or some of the aspects that you're seeing out there that you feel could benefit the code if there was changes to it. Also, a good plug for the fact that we have an Urban Forestry Commission that oversees and has a lot of great conversations about some of the regulations and changes and just overall policy that happens in Portland. We're currently looking for a new commissioner position. It's something that you might be interested in. I know we need very thoughtful arborists there, so think about that. And with that, you're gonna get some feedback forms, and it's really helpful for us as we continually update this presentation to know if this information is what you're looking for, if there's additional things that would have been helpful to glean, and we love hearing your feedback.